Hey there, future legend seekers. Have you ever wondered what happens when survival instinct meets pure, unfiltered rage? What if I told you about two sisters who turned the tables on their oppressors so completely that their story became whispered folklore? If you're ready to dive into one of the most intense tales of revenge ever recorded, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who loves untold stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Let me take you back to Arkansas, 1844, where two enslaved sisters discovered that sometimes the hunted become the hunters. My name is Amara, and this is the story of how my sister Hadley and I became something that shouldn't exist, something that made grown men wake up screaming in the middle of the night. The morning it all began, I was picking cotton under the scorching Arkansas sun, my fingers already bleeding from the sharp bowls. Hadley worked beside me, her dark skin glistening with sweat, humming one of Mama's old songs under her breath. We were 17 and 15, respectively, born into chains on Colonel Morrison's plantation, but Mama had always told us we carried something different in our blood, something wild that the white folks could never understand or tame. Amara, Hadley whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling cotton plants. You feel that? I paused, my basket half full, and listened. The air had changed. The usual sounds of the plantation, the overseer's whip cracking, children crying, the constant murmur of exhausted voices had gone silent. Even the birds had stopped singing. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from the direction of the slave quarters, high-pitched and desperate. Hadley and I dropped our baskets simultaneously, our bodies moving before our minds could process what was happening. We ran through the cotton fields, our bare feet pounding against the hard earth, following the sounds of terror that grew louder with each step. What we found when we reached the quarters will haunt me until my dying day. Bodies everywhere, our people, our family, scattered across the ground like broken dolls. Uncle Samuel, who used to carve wooden toys for the children, lay face down in a pool of blood. Aunt Ruth, who had delivered half the babies on the plantation, stared sightlessly at the sky, her throat cut from ear to ear. The children, God, the children were the worst. But it was seeing Mama's body that broke something fundamental inside both of us. She was sprawled near our cabin door, her arms stretched out as if she'd been trying to protect someone. Her beautiful face, the one that used to light up when she sang us to sleep, was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Around her neck, someone had carved a symbol, a crude cross with strange markings that seemed to burn themselves into my memory. No, 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 Hadley was whispering, falling to her knees beside Mama's body. This ain't real. This can't be real. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process the massacre before us. 23 people. 23 souls who had been alive and breathing just hours ago, now reduced to meat and blood under the afternoon sun. That's when I heard the laughter. 4 white men on horseback sat at the edge of the quarters, watching us with the casual interest of men observing livestock. I recognized them immediately. The 4 colonels who owned the largest plantations in the county. Colonel Morrison, our master, sat tall on his black stallion, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold as winter stone. Beside him, Colonel Blackwood cleaned his fingernails with a bloody knife, while Colonel Hayes and Colonel Thornton shared a bottle of whiskey, passing it back and forth like they were at a Sunday picnic. Well, well, Colonel Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the death-soaked ground. Looks like we missed 2 little rabbits. Colonel Blackwood spurred his horse closer, the animal's hooves splashing through puddles of blood. These the ones, Morrison, the daughters of that witch woman? That's them, Morrison confirmed, his gaze fixed on us with scientific curiosity. Look at their eyes, gentlemen. You see it? That wild look their mother had? I felt something stirring deep in my chest, something hot and violent that I'd never experienced before. Beside me, Hadley had gone perfectly still, her breathing shallow and controlled. When I looked at her, I saw something in her expression that made my blood run cold. Not fear, but calculation. "Why?" I heard myself ask, my voice sounding strange and distant. "Why did you kill them?" Colonel Hayes laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Because we could, girl. Because your mama thought she could run from what she owed us, and we needed to send a message." "What message?" Hadley's voice was barely above a whisper, but something in her tone made all four men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "That some debts follow you to the grave," Colonel Thornton said, taking another swig from the bottle. "Your mama made a bargain 20 years ago, and she thought having you two would let her break it. We're here to collect what's ours." I didn't understand what they meant about bargains and debts, but I understood one thing perfectly. These men had murdered our family for sport, and they were planning to do something to us that would be worse than death. That's when it happened. The thing Mama had always warned us about, the wildness she said lived in our blood, finally broke free. I felt it rising from somewhere deep in my core, spreading through my limbs like liquid fire. My vision sharpened until I could see individual drops of sweat on Colonel Morrison's forehead. My hearing became so acute I could distinguish each man's heartbeat. And the smell. God, I could smell their fear starting to bloom beneath their arrogance. Hadley felt it too. I could sense the change in her without looking, could feel the predator awakening in her blood just as it was awakening in mine. "Run!" Colonel Morrison said suddenly, his voice tight with something that might have been recognition. "Run now, and we'll give you a head start before we come hunting." But we didn't run. Instead, Hadley and I looked at each other, and in that moment we made a silent pact that would define the rest of our lives. We would not die as victims. We would not beg for mercy from men who had none to give. We would become something these colonels had never faced before, something that would make them regret the day they decided to cross our family. "We'll run," I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos raging inside me, "but not because we're afraid." "Then why?" Colonel Blackwood asked, leaning forward in his saddle. Hadley smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Because we want you to think you're hunting us." We turned and sprinted toward the tree line, leaving behind everything we'd ever known. Behind us, I heard Colonel Morrison shout orders to his men, heard horses beginning to move, heard the baying of hunting dogs being released. But as Hadley and I disappeared into the Arkansas wilderness, I knew with absolute certainty that the hunt they thought they were beginning would end very differently than they imagined. The colonels had just made the mistake of their lives. They had awakened something in us that should have stayed sleeping, and now there would be a reckoning that would echo through generations. The legend of the two Savage sisters had just been born. 3 weeks in the wilderness changed us in ways I'm still trying to understand. Hadley and I learned to move like shadows through the Arkansas forests, to read the wind for information about our pursuers, to find food and water where civilized people would see only death. But more than that, we learned to embrace the wildness that had awakened in us that terrible day. The thing is, when you stop fighting your true nature, when you stop trying to be what others expect you to be, you discover capabilities you never knew existed. I could track a man's scent for miles now, could tell from the way branches were broken whether someone had passed through running or walking. Hadley had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours, becoming part of the landscape until prey wandered within striking distance. We communicated without words, moved as one entity, thought with a shared mind that terrified and exhilarated us both. The colonel's hunting parties had given up after the first week, declaring us either dead or escaped to Indian territory. But we hadn't gone anywhere. We'd been watching them, learning their patterns, studying their weaknesses like predators observing prey. Colonel Morrison was the first to die, and I chose him specifically because he'd been the one giving orders that day. The storm hit on a Tuesday night in late September, one of those Arkansas tempests that turns the sky black as pitch and sends lightning crackling across the heavens like the wrath of God. perfect hunting weather for creatures like us. Morrison's plantation house sat on a hill overlooking the river, surrounded by oak trees that groaned and swayed in the wind. I'd been watching the place for 3 days, noting the guards' routines, the servants' movements, the way Morrison himself liked to take a brandy in his study every night at exactly 10 o'clock. Hadley and I approached from the east, using the storm as cover. The rain had turned the ground to mud, muffling our footsteps, while the thunder masked any small sounds we might make. We moved like ghosts through his carefully manicured gardens, past the slave quarters where our surviving people huddled in fear, toward the main house where our first target waited. The guards were useless in weather like this, more concerned with staying dry than watching for threats they believed no longer existed. We slipped past them easily, scaling the side of the house using the ivy that Morrison's wife had planted for decoration. How fitting that her vanity would provide the means for her husband's destruction. Morrison's study was on the 2nd floor, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the storm-dark night. Through the glass, I could see him exactly where I'd expected, sitting behind his massive oak desk, a crystal tumbler of brandy in his hand, reading what looked like financial documents by lamplight. He looked so ordinary, so human, sitting there in his comfortable chair. It was hard to reconcile this mundane figure with the monster who had ordered the slaughter of 23 innocent people. But then I remembered Mama's face, remembered the children's bodies, and the wildness in my blood began to sing. Hadley positioned herself by the door while I worked on the window latch. The mechanism was old and corroded, but my newfound strength made quick work of it. The window swung open silently, letting in a gust of rain-soaked wind that made the lamp flame dance. Morrison looked up from his papers, frowning at the sudden draft. "Damn windows," he muttered, rising from his chair to investigate. That's when he saw me. I was crouched on his windowsill like some nightmare creature, rain streaming from my hair, my eyes reflecting the lamplight like an animal's. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. The master and the slave, the hunter and the hunted, the civilized man and the wild thing he had created. "You," he whispered, his face going pale. "But you're supposed to be dead." "No, so are 23 other people," I replied, dropping silently into his study. Funny how things don't always work out the way we plan. He lunged for the bell pull that would summon his guards, but Hadley was already there, having slipped through the door while his attention was fixed on me. She caught his wrist in a grip that made him gasp with pain. "Sit down, Colonel," she said softly. "We need to have a conversation." Morrison's eyes darted between us, and I could smell his fear now, sharp and acrid, like burning metal. "What do you want? Money? I can give you money. Safe passage north? I have connections." "We want answers," I interrupted, moving closer until I was standing directly in front of his desk. "Starting with why you killed our family." "I told you," he said, his voice shaking. "Your mother owed a debt. She made a bargain and tried to break it. We couldn't allow that." "What kind of bargain?" Hadley asked, tightening her grip on his wrist until I heard bones creak. Morrison's face contorted with pain, but also with something else, a kind of desperate calculation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he gasped. "Your mother, she wasn't just any slave. She was part of something bigger, something that goes back generations. The 4 of us, we were chosen to maintain the balance, to ensure that certain bloodlines remained under control." "Bloodlines?" I felt that familiar heat building in my chest again. "What are you talking about?" "Look at yourselves!" Morrison shouted suddenly, his fear giving way to a kind of manic desperation. "Look at what you've become. You think this is natural? You think normal people can do what you're doing? Your mother carried something in her blood, something old and dangerous, and she passed it to you." Thunder crashed outside, so loud it seemed to shake the entire house. In the brief silence that followed, I could hear Morrison's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You're saying we're not human," Hadley said quietly. "I'm saying you're more than human," Morrison replied. And that's exactly why you're so dangerous. That's why the bargain was made in the first place, to keep your kind contained, controlled, useful, but not free. I felt something snap inside me then, some final restraint that had been holding back the full force of what I'd become. The wildness surged through me like a flood, and suddenly Morrison's study seemed too small, too confining, too civilized for what I needed to do. "Then I guess the bargain is broken," I said. What happened next was swift and brutal and absolutely necessary. Morrison tried to scream, but Hadley's hand was already over his mouth. He tried to fight, but we were stronger now, faster, more focused than any human had a right to be. The storm outside provided a symphony of thunder and wind to mask the sounds of justice being served. When it was over, we left him slumped over his desk, his blood mixing with the ink from his precious financial documents. But before we departed, I carved the same symbol into his forehead that someone had carved into Mama's neck. Let his fellow colonels know that their sins were coming home to roost. As we slipped back out into the storm, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. 1 down, 3 to go. But Morrison's words haunted me as we disappeared into the night. What had he meant about bloodlines and bargains? What exactly were Hadley and I becoming? And most importantly, if we weren't entirely human anymore, what did that make us? The answers would have to wait. We had 3 more colonels to visit, and the storm was just beginning. The news of Colonel Morrison's death spread through the county like wildfire, but the official story bore no resemblance to the truth. According to the sheriff's report, Morrison had been killed by unknown assailants during a robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen, of course, and the strange symbol carved into his forehead was conveniently omitted from all public accounts. But among the slave quarters and servant halls, a different story circulated in whispers, a story about 2 ghost women who moved like smoke and struck like lightning, who had come to collect a debt written in blood. Hadley and I had taken refuge in an abandoned cabin deep in the Ouachita Mountains, a place so remote that even the most determined bounty hunters wouldn't think to look for us there. It had belonged to a trapper who died the previous winter, leaving behind a shelter that was crude but functional, hidden among towering pines and accessible only by paths that game animals had worn through the undergrowth. We'd been there for 2 weeks, planning our next move, when she found us. I was checking the snares I'd set for rabbits when I heard Hadley's voice calling my name with an urgency that made my blood run cold. I sprinted back toward the cabin, expecting to find bounty hunters or soldiers, but instead discovered my sister standing perfectly still in our small clearing, staring at an elderly black woman who sat calmly on a fallen log as if she'd been invited for tea. The woman was ancient, her dark skin weathered like old leather, her white hair braided with small bones and what looked like dried herbs. She wore a patchwork dress that had seen better decades, and her feet were bare despite the October chill. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were the same unusual amber color as Mama's, the same shade that Hadley and I had inherited. "Amara," the old woman said, and her voice carried the weight of years and secrets. "Child, you look just like your grandmother. Who are you?" I demanded, my hand instinctively moving to the knife I now carried at my belt. "How do you know my name?" "I'm Esther," she replied, rising slowly from the log. "I was your mama's teacher before she was taken to Morrison's plantation, before she made the mistake that got her killed." Hadley stepped closer to me, and I could feel the tension radiating from her body. "What mistake?" Esther's ancient face creased into something that might have been a smile. "The same mistake you 2 are about to make if someone doesn't set you straight. Sit down, children. It's time you learned the truth about what you are." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself settling onto the ground beside Hadley. There was something about this woman, something that felt familiar and dangerous, and absolutely necessary. "Your mama's name wasn't really Sarah," Esther began. her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a story that had been passed down through generations. It was Asha, and she came from a line of women who carried something special in their blood, something that white folks have been trying to control for longer than you can imagine. Morrison said something about bloodlines, Hadley said quietly, about bargains and debts. Esther nodded grimly. 20 years ago, your mama was part of a ritual, a ceremony that was supposed to bind her power, make her controllable, useful to the four colonels who fancied themselves masters of forces they barely understood. But Asha was stronger than they anticipated. She broke free during the ritual, killed 2 of their associates, and disappeared into the night. What kind of ritual? I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Blood magic, Esther replied simply. The colonels had discovered that certain bloodlines carried abilities that could be harvested, enhanced, controlled. They'd been experimenting for years, trying to create the perfect servants, people with supernatural capabilities but broken wills. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture that made my stomach turn. They were trying to make weapons out of people. Smart girl, Esther said approvingly. Your mama escaped before they could complete the process, but she was already pregnant with you, Amara. The ritual had changed her, and those changes passed to her children. That's why you and Hadley can do things that normal folks can't. But why kill everyone? Hadley's voice was barely above a whisper. Why murder all those innocent people? Esther's expression darkened. Because your mama had been hiding among them for 20 years, and the colonels finally tracked her down. They needed to make sure no one else carried the bloodline, no one else who might have inherited her abilities. They thought they'd killed you too as well. But we survived, I said. You did more than survive, Esther corrected. You awakened. The trauma, the rage, the desperate need for survival, it triggered the abilities that had been lying dormant in your blood. You became what your mama had been before the ritual tried to break her. I thought about the changes I'd felt over the past month, the enhanced senses, the supernatural strength and speed, the way Hadley and I seem to share thoughts sometimes. What exactly are we? Esther was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces with those ancient amber eyes. Your people have many names for it. Some call it the wolf spirit, others the shadow walker, the night hunter. But the truth is simpler and more complicated than any of those labels. You're human, but you're also something else, something that was old when the first ships brought slaves to these shores. Are there others like us? Hadley asked. There were, Esther said sadly. But the colonels and men like them have been hunting your kind for generations, trying to capture and control what they can't understand. Your mama was one of the last free ones, and now there's just you two. The weight of that revelation settled over us like a shroud. We weren't just seeking revenge for our family's murder. We were the last of our kind, carrying the hopes and memories of an entire bloodline that had been systematically destroyed. The colonels, I said. They'll keep coming for us. They will, Esther confirmed. But here's what they don't know. The ritual that was supposed to bind your mama's power, the one she escaped from, it left a mark on all 4 of them. A connection that works both ways. They can sense when you're near, but you can sense them too if you know how to listen. She reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew a small leather cord, strung with what looked like animal teeth and carved bone. This belonged to your mama. It will help you focus your abilities, help you track the men who destroyed your family. I took the necklace with trembling hands, and the moment it touched my skin, I felt a surge of power that nearly knocked me backward. Suddenly I could sense things I'd never noticed before. The heartbeats of small animals in the forest, the movement of wind through distant trees, and something else. Something that felt like cold malice emanating from 3 distinct points scattered across the county. I can feel them, I whispered. Good, Esther said, rising to her feet. Then you're ready for the next phase of your education. But remember, children, power without wisdom is just destruction. Your mama learned that the hard way. Where are you going? Hadley asked as the old woman began walking toward the tree line. To prepare for what's coming, Esther replied without turning around. The colonels know you're still alive now, and they'll be taking precautions. But they're also desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. Use that against them. She paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back at us one final time. Your mama would be proud of what you've become. But she'd also want you to remember that revenge is just the beginning. What you do after you've settled your debts, that's what will define who you really are. Then she was gone, disappearing into the forest as silently as she'd appeared, leaving Hadley and me alone with the truth about our heritage and the terrible knowledge of what we'd have to do to honor it. 3 colonels remained, and now I knew exactly where to find them. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. The necklace Esther had given me changed everything. With Mama's talisman around my neck, I could feel the remaining colonels like distant flames in the darkness. Colonel Blackwood burning with cold malice from his plantation to the south, Colonel Hayes radiating nervous energy from his estate near the river, and Colonel Thornton pulsing with something that felt like desperate hunger from his holdings in the eastern part of the county. But more than that, I could sense their fear. They knew Morrison was dead, knew that his death hadn't been random violence or a robbery gone wrong. They were taking precautions now, surrounding themselves with guards, varying their routines, sleeping in different rooms each night. They thought they were being clever. They had no idea they were making themselves easier to track. Hadley and I spent 3 days observing their new security measures, noting the patterns in their paranoia, waiting for the perfect opportunity. It came on a Thursday evening when Hayes and Blackwood made the mistake of meeting in person to discuss their mutual problem. The meeting took place at Blackwood's plantation house, a sprawling mansion that sat like a white tumor on a hill overlooking the Arkansas River. From our position in the oak grove that bordered his property, we could see the extra guards he'd posted, the way they moved in coordinated patrols, the nervous energy that radiated from every man carrying a rifle. 12 guards, Hadley whispered, her voice barely audible even to my enhanced hearing, plus whatever servants might be armed inside. Doesn't matter, I replied, fingering the bone and tooth necklace that had become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. They're expecting an attack from outside. They're not prepared for what we've become. The plan was simple in its audacity. Instead of trying to sneak past the guards or wait for a moment of weakness, we would walk straight through the front door and take what we'd come for. The key was timing and the element of absolute surprise. We waited until the dinner hour, when the guards would be tired from a day of heightened vigilance, and the house would be full of servants moving between the kitchen and dining room. Then we simply walked out of the tree line and approached the mansion as if we belonged there. The first guard who saw us actually tipped his hat. "Evening, girls. You lost?" "No, sir," I replied in the submissive tone I'd perfected during years of slavery. "Colonel Blackwood sent for us, something about serving at his dinner party." The guard frowned, clearly confused. "Ain't heard nothing about extra help tonight." That's when Hadley moved. One moment she was standing beside me looking like a harmless young woman. The next, she was behind the guard with her hand over his mouth and something sharp pressed against his throat. He dropped without making a sound. "One down," she whispered. We moved through Blackwood's security perimeter like smoke, using shadows and misdirection and the guards' own assumptions against them. When they saw 2 young black women on the property, they assumed we were servants. When they noticed their colleagues were missing, they assumed they'd stepped away to relieve themselves. By the time they realized what was happening, we were already inside the house. The dining room was exactly where I'd expected it to be, a grand chamber with crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of dead white men staring down from the walls. Blackwood and Hayes sat at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 20, picking at their roast beef while discussing our deaths with the casual interest of men planning a hunting expedition. "Morrison was careless," Hayes was saying as we slipped into the room through the servants' entrance. He should have posted guards, should have varied his routine. These creatures are clearly more intelligent than we anticipated. Creatures, Blackwood replied, cutting his meat with surgical precision. That's exactly what they are, Hayes. Not human, not anymore. The ritual changed them, just like it changed their mother. We're dealing with predators now, not slaves. Then we hunt them like predators, Hayes said, raising his wineglass in a mock toast. Track them down, cage them, study them. Imagine what we could learn from live specimens. That's when I stepped into the light. You won't have to imagine much longer, I said. Both men froze, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from seeing your worst nightmare materialize in your dining room. Hayes dropped his wineglass, sending red liquid splashing across the white tablecloth like blood. Impossible, Blackwood whispered. The guards are indisposed, Hadley said, emerging from the shadows behind Hayes's chair. Just like you're about to be. Odile, what followed was swift and brutal and absolutely necessary. Hayes tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Blackwood reached for a pistol he kept in his jacket, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. They begged, they pleaded, they offered us money and freedom and anything else they thought might save their worthless lives. But we hadn't come for money or freedom. We'd come for justice. When it was over, we searched their bodies and found what we'd been hoping for. Documents, letters, records of their activities over the past 20 years. Most of it was written in code, but some passages were clear enough to make my blood boil. Subject 23 showed remarkable resistance to the binding ritual. One of Blackwood's notes read, "Recommend increasing the blood component and adding iron shackles during the next attempt. The children born to enhanced subjects display abilities from birth," Hayes had written in a letter to someone named Dr. Whitmore. "Suggest immediate separation from mothers to prevent emotional bonding that might interfere with conditioning." They'd been experimenting on people like us for decades, treating human beings like laboratory animals, trying to create a race of supernatural slaves who would serve their masters without question. The scope of their evil was breathtaking in its casual cruelty, but it was the final document we found that changed everything. A letter from Colonel Thornton dated just 3 days earlier. "The specimens have proven more dangerous than anticipated," it read. "Recommend activating the contingency protocol immediately. Dr. Whitmore's research must be preserved at all costs. If the bloodline cannot be controlled, it must be eliminated entirely." Contingency protocol, Hadley said, reading over my shoulder. "What do you think that means?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. "I think it means Thornton isn't just trying to capture us anymore. I think he's planning to make sure no one like us can ever exist again." We left Blackwood and Hayes arranged at their dinner table, their blood mixing with the spilled wine, their dead eyes staring at the portraits of their ancestors. But as we disappeared back into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Thornton was the last colonel, but he was also the most dangerous. And according to the documents we'd found, he had resources and allies that the others had lacked. The final confrontation was coming, and I had the sinking feeling that when it arrived, not all of us would survive it. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, we had sent a message that would echo through every plantation house in Arkansas. The hunted had become the hunters, and the reckoning was far from over. 2 down, 1 to go. The bounty hunters arrived 3 days after we killed Blackwood and Hayes. I smelled them before I saw them, the scent of gun oil and tobacco, sweat and leather, carried on the morning wind that swept through our mountain hideout. Professional killers, not the bumbling local sheriff's deputies who'd been searching for us with all the effectiveness of blind men in a maze. 6 of them, Hadley whispered, her enhanced senses picking up the same information mine had. "Moving in a coordinated pattern from the south. They know what they're doing." I fingered Mama's necklace, feeling the familiar surge of power that came with the contact. Through the bone and tooth talisman, I could sense Colonel Thornton's presence like a cold star burning in the distance. He was still at his plantation, still alive, still planning whatever contingency protocol the documents had mentioned. But he'd sent professionals to deal with us while he prepared his final gambit. "They're not here to capture us," I said, reading the intent in their movements, the way they spread out to cover all possible escape routes. "They're here to end this." "Good," Hadley replied, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I was getting tired of running anyway. The truth was, we'd both changed over the past month in ways that went beyond the supernatural abilities we'd inherited. The constant danger, the need to hunt and kill to survive, the weight of being the last of our kind. It had stripped away everything soft and civilized about us, leaving behind something primal and deadly and absolutely uncompromising. We were apex predators now, and it was time to remind the world what that meant. The hunters had made camp in a clearing about 2 miles from our cabin, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They'd posted sentries, built a proper fire, even brought a pack of bloodhounds to track our scent. Everything about their setup screamed military precision and professional competence. They had no idea they were being watched by creatures who could move through the forest like ghosts. I spent the afternoon studying them through the scope of a rifle I'd taken from one of Blackwood's guards. The leader was a tall, lean man with graying hair and scars that spoke of violence survived. His name was Garrett, according to the conversations I'd overheard, and he'd been hunting problem slaves for over a decade. The others were cut from the same cloth, hard men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. "The dogs are the real threat," Hadley observed as we planned our approach. "They'll smell us coming from a quarter-mile away." "Not if we approach from downwind," I replied, "and not if we give them something else to focus on." The plan we developed was simple but effective. While Hadley circled around to approach the camp from the north, I would create a distraction from the south, something loud and violent enough to draw their attention while she eliminated the sentries. Then we would close the trap and finish what Thornton had started. I waited until full dark before making my move, using the moonless night as cover while I crept through the underbrush toward their camp. The bloodhounds caught my scent when I was still 50 yards away, but by then it was too late for their masters to react properly. The first indication the hunters had that something was wrong came when their dogs started howling in terror instead of excitement. Animals, it turned out, had an instinctive understanding of what Hadley and I had become. They could smell the predator beneath our human appearance, could sense that we were something that shouldn't exist in the natural order. "What's got into them damn dogs?" I heard one of the hunters mutter as the hounds strained against their leashes, desperate to flee in any direction that would take them away from us. "Probably caught scent of a bear," Garrett replied, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Johnson, take Miller and check the perimeter. Something's got them spooked." That's when I struck. I came out of the darkness like a nightmare given form, moving faster than human eyes could track, striking with a precision that years of slavery had never taught me, but that seemed to flow from some deeper source. The first hunter died before he could even reach for his weapon. The second managed to get his rifle halfway to his shoulder before I broke his neck with my bare hands. The camp erupted into chaos. Men shouted orders, guns fired blindly into the darkness. The terrified dogs broke free from their restraints and scattered into the forest. But in the confusion, none of them noticed the shadow that was Hadley moving among them like death incarnate. "Where are they?" Garrett roared, spinning in circles with his pistol drawn. "Where the hell are they?" "Right here," I said, stepping into the firelight. He spun toward me, finger tightening on the trigger, but Hadley was already behind him. Her hand closed over his gun arm, and I heard bones snap like dry kindling. "You're Garrett," I said conversationally as he fell to his knees, cradling his ruined arm. "You've been hunting people like us for 10 years. 12, he gasped through gritted teeth. 12 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like you two." "That's because there's never been anything like us," Hadley said, circling him like a wolf studying wounded prey. We're the last ones, the end of a bloodline that your employers have been trying to destroy for generations. Thornton, I said, what's the contingency protocol? Garrett's face went pale, and I could smell the fear sweat breaking out across his skin. I don't know what you're talking about. I knelt down until we were eye to eye, letting him see the inhuman intelligence that burned behind my gaze. You're going to tell us everything you know about Thornton's plans. You're going to tell us where he is, what resources he has, and what he's planning to do next. And you're going to do it right now, or what happened to your friends is going to seem merciful compared to what happens to you. What followed was an education in the true scope of the conspiracy we'd stumbled into. Thornton wasn't just the last of the 4 colonels, he was the architect of the entire program, the man who'd been coordinating the capture and experimentation on people like us for over 20 years. He had connections in Washington, funding from sources Garrett couldn't even name, and access to resources that went far beyond what a simple plantation owner should possess. There's a facility, Garrett finally admitted, his voice broken by pain and terror, hidden in the bayou country about 50 miles southeast of here. That's where they take the specimens, where they do the real work. Thornton's been moving his operation there ever since you killed Morrison. What kind of facility? Hadley demanded. Laboratory, prison, slaughterhouse, depends on what they need at the time. Garrett's eyes were glazing over with shock, but he kept talking. They've got maybe 30 people there now, all of them like you. Enhanced, changed. Most of them broken beyond repair. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. We weren't the last of our kind after all. There were others, dozens of them, being held captive and tortured in some hidden facility while we'd been focused on our personal revenge. The contingency protocol, I said urgently. What is it? If they can't control the bloodline, they eliminate it, Garrett whispered. All of it. Everyone who carries the genetic markers, everyone who might pass them on. Thornton's got enough poison gas to kill everything within a 10-mile radius of that facility. When? Hadley's voice was deadly quiet. Soon, Garrett said. Maybe days, maybe hours. He was waiting to see if we could bring you in alive, but now... He gestured weakly at the bodies of his companions. Now he knows you can't be taken. He'll activate the protocol and start over somewhere else. I felt something cold and terrible settle in my chest. 30 people like us, imprisoned and helpless, about to be murdered because Hadley and I had been too focused on our personal vendetta to see the bigger picture. Our quest for revenge had doomed the very people we should have been trying to save. You're going to take us there, I told Garrett. You're going to show us exactly where this facility is, and you're going to help us get inside. I can't, he protested. Even if I wanted to, the place is a fortress. Guards, walls, automated defenses. It's designed to keep things in, not to keep people out. Then we'll have to be creative, Hadley said. As we prepared to leave the destroyed camp behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Thornton had been planning for this moment since the day Mamar escaped from his ritual, and now he was finally ready to end the bloodline once and for all. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that revenge was all we cared about, that personal vendetta was the limit of our ambition. He was about to learn that some hunts don't end until every predator in the pack has been fed. The real war was just beginning. The facility squatted in the Louisiana bayou like a cancer, its concrete walls rising from the swampland like something that had crawled out of a fever dream. Garrett hadn't lied about it being a fortress. Razor wire-crowned 15-foot walls. Guard towers stood at each corner with searchlights that swept the surrounding marsh in regular patterns, and the single road leading to the main gate was heavily fortified with checkpoints and armed patrols. It looked more like a military installation than anything a plantation owner should have been able to construct. "How long has this place existed?" I asked Garrett as we crouched in the cypress grove that provided our only cover. 5 years, maybe 6, he replied, his broken arm cradled against his chest. Thornton started construction right after the government contracts came through. Government contracts? Hadley's voice was sharp with suspicion. You think this was just about 4 plantation owners playing with forces they didn't understand? Garrett laughed bitterly. This goes all the way to Washington, girls. There are people in very high places who are very interested in what you can do. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that was even more horrifying than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about controlling a handful of enhanced slaves. This was about weaponizing an entire bloodline, turning people like us into tools for whoever was willing to pay the highest price. The prisoners, I said. Where are they being held? Garrett pointed toward a low building near the center of the compound. Cell Block C. That's where they keep the enhanced subjects. Most of them have been there for years, broken down by experiments and conditioning until they're barely human anymore. I felt Mama's necklace grow warm against my skin, and suddenly I could sense them. Dozens of minds crying out in pain and desperation, their enhanced abilities turned inward in an endless spiral of suffering. Some of them had been children when they were captured. Others had been adults who'd tried to live normal lives until Thornton's hunters found them. All of them were about to die unless we could stop the contingency protocol. The gas, Hadley said. Where do they keep it? Underground storage facility beneath the main laboratory, Garrett replied. Thornton's got enough concentrated toxin down there to kill everything within a 20-mile radius. He's planning to release it through the ventilation system, make it look like an industrial accident. And Thornton himself? Command center on the top floor of the main building. He'll be monitoring everything from there, probably with a gas mask and an escape route already prepared. I studied the facility through the scope of my stolen rifle, noting the guard rotations, the blind spots in their surveillance, the weak points in their defenses. It was a formidable target, but not an impossible one. The key would be speed and coordination. We'd have to move fast enough to prevent them from activating the gas release while simultaneously freeing the prisoners and eliminating Thornton. There's something else, Garrett said quietly. Something you need to know before you go in there. What? Your mother, she's not dead. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. That's impossible. We saw her body. You saw a body, Garrett corrected. But it wasn't hers. Thornton's been keeping her alive for 20 years, using her as a test subject, trying to understand how she broke free from the original ritual. She's in there, in the deepest part of the facility, and she's the real reason he's activating the contingency protocol now. Why now? Hadley demanded. Because she's finally ready to escape again, Garrett said. And this time, she's not alone. The revelation changed everything. Our mission was no longer just about revenge, or even about saving the other prisoners. It was about reuniting with the mother we'd thought was dead, the woman who'd been suffering in captivity while we'd been learning to embrace our true nature. The plan changes, I said to Hadley. We go in fast and hard, but our priority is reaching Mama first. If she's as powerful as Esther suggested, she can help us free the others. And Thornton? Thornton dies last, I replied. I want him to watch everything he's built burn down around him before I end his miserable life. We waited until the darkest part of the night before making our move, using the swamp itself as our ally. The enhanced abilities we'd inherited from Mama included an almost supernatural affinity for moving through water and marsh, and we slipped through the bayou like creatures born to it. The outer perimeter was easier to breach than it should have been. The guards were focused on threats coming from the road, not from the swamp itself. We eliminated the sentries silently, using techniques that seemed to flow from some deep genetic memory, then scaled the walls, using nothing but our enhanced strength and agility. Inside the compound, the facility was a maze of corridors and laboratories, holding cells and administrative offices. But Mama's necklace guided us like a compass, pulling us deeper into the complex toward the source of the psychic distress I'd been sensing. We found her in a cell that was more laboratory than prison, surrounded by monitoring equipment and restraint devices that spoke of decades of systematic torture. She was older than I remembered, her hair gone completely white, her body bearing the scars of countless experiments. But her eyes, those same amber eyes that Hadley and I had inherited, burned with an intelligence and fury that 20 years of captivity hadn't been able to break. "My daughters," she whispered as we broke down the door to her cell. "I knew you would come." "Mama," Hadley sobbed, throwing her arms around the woman we'd thought was lost forever. But there was no time for proper reunions. Even as we embraced, alarms began blaring throughout the facility, and I could hear the sound of boots running in our direction. "The gas," Mama said urgently. "Thornton's activating the protocol. We have minutes before this entire place becomes a death trap." "The other prisoners," I began. "I'll handle them," Mama interrupted. "You two need to stop the gas release and deal with Thornton. This ends tonight, one way or another." What followed was a running battle through the corridors of the facility, with Mama moving like a force of nature unleashed after 20 years of restraint. She freed the other prisoners with the efficiency that spoke of long planning, while Hadley and I fought our way toward the underground storage area where the poison gas was kept. The guards we encountered weren't prepared for what we'd become. They'd been trained to handle normal prisoners, maybe even enhanced individuals who'd been broken by years of captivity. They weren't ready for two fully awakened predators who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. We reached the storage facility just as the automated release system began its activation sequence. Hadley disabled the mechanism while I eliminated the technicians who'd been trying to implement Thornton's final solution. But even as we prevented the immediate catastrophe, I knew the real confrontation was still waiting for us. Thornton was in his command center, watching his life's work crumble around him, and I intended to make sure he had a front-row seat for his own destruction. The last colonel was about to learn what happened when you tried to cage something that was born to be free. The hunt was almost over, but the most dangerous prey was still alive, and he was waiting for us. Colonel Thornton was waiting for us in his command center, but he wasn't alone. The top floor of the main building had been converted into something that looked more like a war room than an office, with banks of monitors showing every corner of the facility, communication equipment that could reach anywhere in the world, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. But it was the figure standing beside Thornton that made my blood run cold. Dr. Whitmore was exactly what I'd expected. A thin, pale man with the kind of clinical detachment that allowed him to torture human beings in the name of science. But the woman beside him, the one wearing a Union Army uniform with colonel's insignia, was a complete surprise. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell," she introduced herself with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "United States Army Special Projects Division. I've been looking forward to meeting you two." "Government," Hadley said, and I could hear the disgust in her voice. "The highest levels," Mitchell confirmed. "What you've stumbled into here isn't just some rogue plantation owner's private experiment. This is a national security operation that's been in development for over 2 decades. Through the windows of the command center, I could see the facility burning below us. Mama and the freed prisoners were systematically destroying everything they could find, erasing 20 years of research and documentation. But the 3 people in this room represented something larger and more dangerous than any single installation. "You want to turn us into weapons," I said. "We want to understand what you are," Dr. Whitmore replied, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a scientist discussing his favorite subject. "Your bloodline represents an evolutionary leap that could change the course of human history. The applications for military use alone are irrelevant," I interrupted, "because you're all about to die." Thornton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you've won? You think destroying this place changes anything? We have facilities in 12 states, research programs in 3 countries, and genetic samples from over 200 subjects. This is just the beginning. Maybe, I replied, moving closer to the group, but it's the end for you. What happened next was swift and brutal and absolutely necessary. Mitchell reached for her sidearm, but Hadley was already moving. Whitmore tried to activate some kind of emergency beacon, but I broke his arm before he could complete the motion. Thornton, the man who'd orchestrated our family's murder and 20 years of systematic torture, tried to run. He made it exactly 3 steps before I caught him. "Please," he gasped as I lifted him off the ground with one hand. "I can give you information, resources, connections. I can help you find the other facilities." "We'll find them ourselves," I said. "But the research," he pleaded. "Everything we've learned about your kind, all the data we've collected. If you kill us, it dies with us." "Good," Hadley said, finishing with Mitchell and Whitmore. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist." I looked into Thornton's eyes and saw the same casual cruelty that had allowed him to order the massacre of 23 innocent people, the same scientific detachment that had let him torture our mother for 2 decades. He wasn't human in any way that mattered. He was a disease that needed to be eliminated. "This is for Mama," I said, and ended his miserable existence. When it was over, we stood in the command center surrounded by the bodies of our enemies, watching through the windows as the facility burned below us. The other prisoners, our people, were escaping into the bayou, finally free after years of captivity. Some of them would probably die out there, too broken by their experiences to survive in the wild. But others would adapt, would learn to embrace their true nature the way Hadley and I had. "Is it over?" Hadley asked. "This part is," I replied. "But Thornton was right about one thing. There are other facilities, other people like us who need to be freed. This was just the beginning." Mama found us as we were preparing to leave the burning command center. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd finally remembered what freedom felt like, her amber eyes bright with possibilities I was only beginning to understand. "The records," she said, holding up a stack of documents she'd salvaged from Whitmore's laboratory. "Names, locations, genetic profiles, everyone they've taken, everyone they're planning to take." I looked at the files in her hands and felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. We weren't just the last of our kind anymore. We were the first of something new. The bloodline that men like Thornton had tried to control and weaponize was free now, and it was up to us to decide what that freedom meant. 12 facilities, Hadley said, reading over the documents. Hundreds of our people still in captivity. "Then we have work to do," I replied. We left the facility as the sun was rising over the Louisiana bayou. 3 generations of the same bloodline finally reunited after 20 years of separation. Behind us, the concrete walls crumbled into the swamp, taking with them the last physical evidence of Thornton's crimes. But the memory of what had happened there, the knowledge of what we were capable of when pushed too far, would live on. The freed prisoners scattered to the 4 winds, some heading north toward territories where they might find safety, others disappearing into the deep wilderness where civilization couldn't follow. A few chose to stay with us, forming the nucleus of something that wasn't quite a family and wasn't quite an army, but was definitely something the world had never seen before. Over the following months, we systematically dismantled the network that Thornton and his government allies had built. Facility by facility, laboratory by laboratory, we freed our people and eliminated those who had imprisoned them. Some of the installations were heavily defended, requiring careful planning and coordinated attacks. Others fell easily, their guards unprepared for enemies who could move like shadows and strike like lightning. The government tried to stop us, of course. They sent soldiers, hired mercenaries, even attempted to negotiate, but they were fighting an enemy they didn't understand, using tactics designed for conventional warfare against creatures who operated by entirely different rules. We became legends during those months. Stories whispered around campfires and in slave quarters, tales of two sisters who could appear anywhere and disappear just as quickly, who left behind only empty cells and dead oppressors. Some called us angels of vengeance, others called us demons. We didn't care what they called us as long as they feared us. The last facility fell on a cold December night in Virginia, its walls breached by people who had learned to embrace the wildness in their blood. When the smoke cleared and the prisoners were free, we gathered in the ruins to decide what came next. "They'll rebuild," one of the freed prisoners said. "Find new locations, new methods. This kind of evil doesn't just disappear." "Then we'll be waiting for them," Mama replied. "We'll teach our children to be waiting for them, and their children after that." "What about the ones who don't know what they are?" Hadley asked. "The ones who carry the bloodline but haven't awakened yet? We find them first," I said. "We teach them, protect them, help them understand their heritage before someone like Thornton can get to them." And that's exactly what we did. Over the years that followed, we built a network of our own, not facilities or laboratories, but safe houses and training grounds, places where people like us could learn to control their abilities without fear of capture or exploitation. We became teachers and protectors, guardians of a bloodline that had survived centuries of persecution. Some of us chose to live quietly, blending into normal society while keeping watch for signs of renewed government interest. Others embraced the wildness completely, becoming creatures of legend who haunted the nightmares of those who would oppress the innocent. All of us remembered the lessons we'd learned in Arkansas and Louisiana, that freedom was something you had to fight for, and that some fights never really ended. The government eventually gave up their attempts to capture and control us, at least officially. There were still occasional incidents, still researchers who thought they could succeed where Thornton had failed, still politicians who dreamed of supernatural soldiers. But they learned to be more careful, more subtle in their approaches, and we learned to be more vigilant in response. Hadley and I never returned to Arkansas, but we never forgot it either. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried the scent of distant storms, we would tell the younger ones about the plantation where it all began, about the massacre that awakened our true nature, about the 4 colonels who thought they could cage the wind. The stories always ended the same way, with the reminder that some debts can only be paid in blood, and that the hunted can become the hunters when they finally stop running and start fighting back. Years passed, decades. The world changed around us, but we remained constant, guardians of a secret that was older than slavery, older than America itself. We had children who carried the bloodline forward, who learned from birth that they were something special, something that needed to be protected and preserved. And sometimes, late at night, when the civilized world was sleeping, we would hear whispers on the wind, stories of 2 sisters who had vanished into legend, who might still be out there somewhere, watching and waiting. The truth was simpler and more complex than the stories suggested. We were exactly where we'd always been, doing exactly what we'd always done, protecting our people, honoring our heritage, and making sure that no one ever again made the mistake of thinking they could own what was meant to be free. The legend of the 2 savage sisters had become something larger than revenge, larger than any individual story of triumph over oppression. It had become a promise that somewhere in the darkness something wild and free was watching, and that those who preyed on the innocent would eventually face a reckoning that echoed through generations. The colonels were long dead, their names forgotten by history, but we remained, and we would always remain, as long as there were people who needed protecting and predators who needed hunting. The silence of night carried our promise across the years, and the wind remembered our names. Some legends never die, they just learn to hunt more quietly. And that's the complete story of Amara and Hadley, the 2 sisters who refused to remain victims and instead became the stuff of legend. Their tale reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to oppression isn't submission or escape. It's transformation into something your oppressors never saw coming. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more untold tales of courage and revenge. Share this with someone who appreciates stories of triumph against impossible odds, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because stories like this deserve to be heard around the world. Until next time, remember, some hunts never end, and some legends